Okay,
Yeah, I didn't get on the course.
let's call the meeting to order. This is the 27th day of May 2025. This is a meeting of the Recode Rowlett stakeholders meeting. And it is 5:15 according to the clock on the wall here in the work session office. And I guess we need to adopt the minutes from April 4, 2025 meeting and May 13, 2025 meeting. Is that correct?
April 22nd, yes, and May 13th.
Okay. So, did everybody get your emails with the minutes attached? Have you had a chance to read over it? Is there any changes, amendments to the minutes of April 22, 2025?
No.
Hearing none, I'll call for a motion to adopt the minutes of April 22, 2025.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Martin, is that correct?
Yes.
And a second by Mr. Dameron?
Yeah.
Okay. All those in favor, raise your hands. All those against or not for the passage? It's unanimous. May 13, 2022 minutes. Any changes or amendments to those minutes? Hearing none, I will look for a motion to accept the minutes as printed.
Motion.
Motion by Mr. Martin and a second by Ms. Williams to adopt the minutes as printed on May 13, 2025 meeting. All those in favor, raise your hands. All those opposed, like sign. That's unanimous, that it passes. Anything else that this committee or the commission needs to talk about before we turn it over to Assistant City Manager? You got one, another one coming in.
My apologies for being late.
That's okay. So, if not, then it's Mr. Bauer, it's yours.
Thank you very much. So we sent you a handout in advance. Everybody knows the matrix all done. We filled those all out. I hope you didn't, because we're going to talk about sort of how to move forward. But I had somebody ask me, "Oh, we're supposed to get this done." Anyway, sorry, I digress. So for today's meeting, check with the red button. So quickly go over the meeting objective. We'll talk about differential between zoning and development standards. And we'll talk about sort of our approach as a committee on how we tackle this beast. And it's the old story, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. We're there to make sure we have some consensus on how we approach the tasks in front of us. We'll talk about residential zoning. Granularity, that's a new term for me. Specificity, basically sort of how we want to approach that. Some characteristics, and we'll talk about the process, your feedback about, whether we're moving too fast, too slow, and make sure we're moving at a pace that you're comfortable with. And then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about in the next meeting. So being objective, we're going to clarify scope and approach. That's what I talked about here, basically make sure we understand how we're going to tackle these things. And our recommendation is that we focus initially on residential zones, but again, it's open for discussion. Always going to have this slide in here, just to sort of reinforce where we're at, what the council has given us as far as our goal. Hey, are you our new member?
Yes.
Please join us.
There's a seat over there, there's a seat over there, and one here.
And there's also a sandwich and drinks in there.
Sorry, I had to come up from downtown Dallas, so I'm always gonna be a little late.
So the first key topic I wanted to get in today was zoning versus development standards. And I pulled this Venn diagram because sometimes there's that area in the middle where it's a little bit of both, right? We're going to focus initially on zoning, but there will get to some point development standards. The reason why this dichotomy or this difference between these two is important is that when you're changing zoning, there's a process you have to go through to adopt that that's different from when you change development standards. One requires significant supermajority notification, the other one doesn't, no ordinance change. Until Texas decides they want to implement it differently, which they may be doing. But right now, when we talk about development standards and zoning, there's a difference. Development standards is about land use. I'm sorry, zoning is about land use, development standards are about design. I've got some examples. So zoning is really about sort of that, as we talked about before, the differential between commercial, industrial, residential. It's about their uses, dimensional requirements, heights, setbacks, stuff, density, stuff we've discussed. And, you know, again, you're talking about a different kind of R1, R2, R3. That's kind of the zoning piece. Commercial 1, commercial 2. Development standards are more about the rules of your infrastructure, what you want the streets to look like. Some of the things that we use currently are garage layouts. You know, when you're going to have an alley. Those are design development standards, separate from zoning. Lots of times we kind of treat them the same. They're certainly part of two different sections of the code. If you've heard the term UDO, or Unified Development Ordinance, some communities will actually bring them together and put them in a common ordinance. That sort of muddies the difference between the two of them. I've done 3 UDOs in my career. They're a challenge, but it's a lot of work. We're going to get into some of this because we have some inconsistency in different areas of our code. And to bring those codes together, we need to address some of this. Our priority will be to focus on zoning first, because that allows us to accomplish that first piece the council has directed us to focus on, which is getting rid of the form-based code. Questions about zoning versus development standards? No, that was that clear, that quick? Mud.
Well, just a question, I guess, usually, so obviously we're, as you said, we're gonna focus on zoning. Do we come back towards the end of this then, and we're gonna flesh it out with development standards, but once we've really gone through the zoning piece of it, is that the progression here?
We're gonna pick and choose.
Or are we gonna get kind of going this way as we go along?
Well, our recommendation is that we focus on what's clearly zoning first. And then there's going to be some areas of gray that we'll likely have to touch in order to address your concerns and the community concerns. But our also recommendation is that we try to avoid getting too deep into that.
Okay.
So for example, when it comes to landscaping standards, we probably want to keep most of what we have in place.
Okay.
But there may be some areas of clarification that need to be addressed.
Okay.
So it's going to be one of those areas where we do some triage work and bring you some ideas. Certainly, if you see something that doesn't make sense, I was actually going to ask you to, previous Mayor Pro Tem, Mayor Pro Tem Shinder brought an issue to the council just recently, and she wanted it included in this conversation. Remember what that was? It was parks? No, what was it? It was, I'll go back and watch the meeting. But she brought in an issue that she wanted to address through this, that actually is a development standard approach, it's not a zoning. Anyway,
But before you leave this, and I'm not averse to this at all, and we were talking in the last meeting about density versus the traditional style. If we left alleys, and I want the group to think about this along with this, if we left alleys instead of just front-loading garages, if we went to an L or a J hook design, that is design and zoning, but it has to do with zoning because you'll have to have wider lots to accomplish a J or an L. Okay, but to the budget of the city, at least that starts taking out alleyways, which are expensive to maintain. So, think about that. Go ahead.
Certainly those alleys, not alleys, garage, not garage, or sort of how we want to put it. Certainly, it's in that area of development standards, and it's probably one that I recommend we do address at some point, but not as the first priority.
No, but just think along the lines that if you do that in zoning and whatever we do, we're gonna have wider lots to accomplish that. Unless you just go front loaded.
Christoph, could you remind us, it's probably back in our old packets and stuff, but when we talk about residential, which is what we're focusing on, how much more of that is there to be developed in the city?
I've already given you this answer, it depends.
Oh,
Yeah, 484 acres was the number.
Yeah, well, I think that it really depends, again, on how flexible you are with infill development. And, because we have a lot of very low density residential that is potential for redevelopment or infill development, if the zoning allows it. If the zoning doesn't allow it, then it's not available. So that's the critical issue here with this whole thing, you know, so we'll put together the tools, how you apply them will communicate to the public and to developers about what's possible. Go one more slide on this. So again, it just summarizes it. Zoning is about land use, broad site layout issues. Design is more about the implementation issues. What is allowed, where, how it must be built or maintained. So kind of some rules of thumb, certainly. Trying to figure out whether we're talking about zoning versus development standard. What I'm talking about, zoning versus development standard. Okay. And the reason why I bring this up, of course, is that, as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing a zoning change, right now, state law says that everyone who's impacted must be noticed. So there must be a formal notice, public hearing. Development standards you can run through is a ordinance change. Like we've considered doing, for example, with tree preservation. Tree preservation is definitely a development standards. We don't have to notice the entire city when we make a change currently. Now, there is some recent change, some holdings that the court system, not sure exactly what level of the court system, probably in one of the appellate courts, that basically tries to treat these both the same, which may change what's required of us in the future. Right now. So page 2 of the handout. You all got it. You memorized it. I didn't print out the handout this time. I should have figured it out. Page 2. Can you show everybody page 2? So this is our consultant sort of full scope of all of the sort of table of contents of things that'll be addressed. Actually, pull it up here. So Article 1, you know, other than the zoning map, most of this is just ministerial stuff that staff and the consultant will work on. Article 2, which is zoning districts, is really something that we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on and working through. Article 3 is an option. And Article 4 is where we start to get in that sort of mixture of procedures. Article 5 and Article 6 are kind of staff process. Technology is great when it works. Well, I think it was before.
Come on.
While you were waiting for technology to catch up here.
Uh-huh.
So just so I'm clear, we're talking about the framework flexible zoning in reference to the density model. this, we have passed that, I just want to make sure we passed that stage. We are working towards a density model of zoning. All these flexible things are things that can or cannot fit within the plan going forward. These aren't other options. That's what I just want to make sure.
Correct. We got this back. So zoning, page 2 of the handout is basically an attempt to basically give you the entire scope of the project, some of what you'll be digging deep into, some of which staff will be handling. And the proposal is to really focus on Article 2 as the first priority, and then the next step, do some non-conformity testing before we go on to other ideas. And when I talk about non-conformity testing, the proposal would be that we actually pull up some zoning areas, some maps of the city, and say, okay, this is what the current zoning is. These are the zoning designations we've developed as a committee. Can we apply those and have it fit? Or does it create a non-conformity? Do a little bit of testing just so we can understand whether we have accomplished what we want to accomplish as a committee in putting together a zoning methodology. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? I wouldn't want to get sort of all the way down to the end here and come back and then we throw up a map and go, oh, well, the whole world is non-conforming. Or we don't have a zone that does that. So that's my thought. We do that, and then we consider whether we want to talk about any flexibility or problem solving. So it kind of builds for you a context. We put together, to use my old toolbox analogy, we put together a big portion of the tools on the zoning side. Try and apply them, see how they fit. Maybe go back and do some corrections if necessary. And then talk about whether we want to create any incentives or the flexibility in the model to address any issues we've identified as we get that testing. What do you guys think about that approach? See some head nods? Okay.
Chris, I apologize for being new and asking the question about this, but the word density-based, is that a defined term in the industry? And the reason I ask is that when I think of density, and if I'm just a regular old Joe citizen and I hear the word density, I think of something nefarious that's going on. Like, okay, this means that the city is trying to become more dense, therefore we're going to see more. You know what I'm saying? Maybe you've already discussed this, but the connotation with density.
I think density is more much like viscosity. Because when you think of viscosity, you think of oil or carbon or something, something that's, but water's viscous, air is viscous.
Right.
So it varies from
Yeah,
one end of the spectrum to the other. So
And to that point,
when we say density, that's what it is.
I think of it as efficiency. And so I just think when you're talking about the process, you're talking about the end game, I would just raise the concern that the word density implies something that may not be intended.
And we're going to have to get over it. Because you're absolutely right. It's a term of art, and we're going to use it no matter what form we're going to use it. Density is exactly what it needs to be. And I get your point. Quickly, my next slide. There's very low density. There's high density. And that's actually the paradigm we're looking at, trying to create here, is that toolbox from very low density to other densities, and be able to decide as a committee in a community what's appropriate for which area of the community. So even when you're using the term, there isn't really a different term that is going to be recognizable. But it's certainly, 1 unit per acre is a low density. It's just the term you use. I can't think of another one to replace it.
Okay, two quick questions. The R1 through R5, is that like an industry standard numbering system? I mean, do we call something an R1 that another city would call an R1, or is it R1 across the board?
Everybody's got different versions of R1.
Okay,
There is no industry standard for R1. In fact, we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about what R1 should be,
okay.
and we're gonna define it for R1.
And then the second question was, what this first question asked, how many, what are we realistically looking at the number of our districts and everything? Because I mean, I'm looking at that and going back to the question earlier, I mean, I don't see that capable for us to have 5 different districts like that.
Does that seem too many or too few?
No, even right there, that sounds like too many when I think of what I consider to be the boundaries of Rowlett. I mean, I don't see where you can put all 5 of the districts out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we can do all of this. I think for me, and it really came up when I was reading through it, is how many different codes we've got. What was the one I was looking at? There were, what was there, 6 zones?
Yeah.
6, and it was all gonna be taken.
What, 32 different zones right now?
Yeah, right now, just on the residential side, currently,
Under
our current
R5
code
right
has
now,
11.
there's currently 1,
Okay.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that would all be rolled into R5. And
Okay.
all of them have several of them. And I think that's, for me personally, that's a good thing. Simplicity, clarity is always good.
No, I agree, but I was looking at the R1 and how it's defined. Do we really have any area left to
Oh, I got
classify it as an R1?
Well, yeah, all your stuff 40s are gonna be R1s.
Okay.
Pretty much anything that isn't developed right now by default is an R1.
Well, see, and that's going back to remember our conversation about conformity versus non-conformity? We have to take a look at the use that's out there now
Okay.
and apply something to it. And we want to apply something to it that is consistent with the current use. And we have a lot of diversity in housing stock out there. Everything from stuff that's fairly dense to fairly low dense. And that's, you can make everything non-conforming by having a very broad zone.
Yeah,
But then by doing that, you lose control.
yeah.
Because then, of course, you have a lot of flexibility on the building side, but no control on the regulatory side.
Off the top of your head, do you remember what the square footage or R1 was, the square footage for the lot?
Well, the current one you have in front of you is either half an acre to 2 acres. And again, that's a decision that we'll have to make as a committee. But I think the first piece is how granular do you want to be? 11 zones, probably more than we need.
Yeah.
Something between 5 and 11 may be the right number, and I don't have an answer for this. And I don't expect you to have the answer for this yet either. I think this is one of those things that we're going to chew on a little bit, and as we go through and start to define these, figure out what the answer is going to be over the next couple of meetings, is my proposal. One of the things that staff and I have been talking about is that, and I've mentioned this probably because I'm tired of hearing this, 34% of the cities in a planned development, a PD. Wouldn't it be nice if we had zones that we could apply to those PDs that would make them conforming and no longer a PD? Would bring them into a standard city zone. That may be more than we can accomplish, but I don't think that's a horrible goal. You guys, Rowlett Road and Miller Road, you're coming, north on Rowlett Road, you take right, I said that wrong. You take the other left, you take the right on Miller Road, and this is a very high dense development plopped in right there. I think they're just completing the last house in that development. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Longhorn Villas.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually zoned currently, the base zoning for that is R40. It's a PD sitting on top of R40. Now, so we zoned that property R40, which is 1 unit per acre. At some point, somebody brought in a PD, said, we want to do this. And as a community, we said, okay. From my perspective, that was a failure to communicate, right? If we knew we wanted that kind of density there, we probably should have zoned it a higher density. now that we have that high density there, what should the zoning be?
You have the exact same thing across the street. That's not developed, and it is SF40. And there has been several plans submitted to P and Z and all for it to go also exactly like the other side in townhomes.
That's actually true. I talked to a developer about that a week and a half ago. And they said, well, we want to do exactly what they did. And so they see it happen in the community and they go, the property owner goes, well, wow. And that's why some of our property values for developable land have gone way up. Because the assumption is that there's the possibility of getting a higher level of zoning there than is currently in place. And so they think that, well, of course, something that's zoned to a higher density is going to be much more valuable than a piece of property that's zoned to a lower density.
And I don't mean to throw a monkey wrench into what you're saying, but we have had in front of P and Z, it's going in front of council, and I hope they send it back because I think it's worthy business to go in an SF40 situation. That's down on the northbound service road of PGBT and Flamingo.
Spot zoning, it's illegal, can't happen.
Well, the guy wants to put in a business that would be compatible with the area, but what the city wanted it to go into is M1, and that was just absolutely the wrong zoning to go to, in my opinion, is an M1. That opened the door, if they flipped the property, what then could go in. You read off a bunch, that particular evening, read off a bunch of things that could go in. And that's certainly, some of those were not compatible. So I can see a PD going in there, or some other zoning, but not what was recommended as an M1.
If I can jump in, I think the legal problem was that our council told us that's spot zoning. That's illegal.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that,
I mean, that property, you're gonna take that one house, that one, whatever it was, 20,000 square feet, nothing around it, any way matches that. That was gonna be spot zoning, and it's just illegal. You just can't do it.
yeah, so
So
I
that,
think that this is a useful digression, so.
okay, but let's, I'm sorry.
And I'm going to,
But let me, before you change on this, then if you looked at that particular piece of property, this is a real piece of property here in the town, what they want to do, then you could go commercial. But then you go back to a PD, zone it commercial, and then list things out of commercial 1 or 2 that it would fit, but not all of the things in those categories.
Why not?
And that's,
Why not? Why not just, I mean, if you're gonna change the zoning, just change the zoning. Because it is commercial and it's right next to the toll road, which is what we expect.
I don't disagree with you there. But there are some things that would possibly go in there that's in a, for instance, a C2, that you would want right next to those houses. And across from that one house, directly across the street.
I just want to clarify, a PD is still spot zoning. So changing to a planned development with an M1 based zoning where you're restricting the use is still spot zoning.
it's possible.
Still want to clarify that.
Yeah, so the challenge we have here, of course, is you have 66 President George Bush Turnpike, and I apologize, I can't reach any higher than this, you guys know I can't put this on right now. Commercial zoning,
I thought you meant your height.
that's a limiter as well, sir. And then we actually have some higher density residential in this area. And the lot we have is right square in the middle here of residential area that wanted to go to an intense sort of industrial use. And you can't do that, whether you're using a PD or a rezone, that's spot zoning. So if you want to transition this to commercial, there's a process for doing that. The process usually starts with changing your land use map first. You go through and you change your comprehensive land use plan that says that we actually want to transition this. And this goes back to our discussion about transit. Remember the whole discussion about transit, which is your transition from commercial to lower density commercial to high density residential, lower density residential, lower density residential. You transition those uses in a way so that you stay compatibility as you move away from your commercial cores to your residential cores.
Right.
So you start with a change to the underlying comprehensive land use map, which identifies how you want to manage that transition. And then you come back and put the zones on top of it. And that's the way you can follow your process legally, because you've done the underlying work first, and then you can lay your zones on top of it. And as we put together the zones, that's the key piece. We want to make sure we have the tools that allow us to create that transition in a way that's sensitive, not only to that business, but also to the existing residential that's here, and the existing residential that's here. So as we haven't done that yet, as far as the comprehensive land use map, and we're not going to do that as part of this process, going back to the comprehensive land use map, because we wanted to address the first problem first, triage, get the zoning change, get rid of form-based code, and believe me, when we get to the form-based code and trying to zone that area, that's going to be a challenge, because we've got some uses in there that are semi-consistent with form-based code and have no relation to the standard zoning throughout the community. So as we talk about sort of what kind of residential zones we want to put together, some of them will design to try and create conformity out of some of the fairly high dense residential uses we have in the form-based code area. So again, we'll create tools. How you apply them is going to be one of the last things we have a conversation about. And of course, in my opinion, will be one of the more challenging ones. That kind of bring context to what this whole conversation about this spot zone piece. We're taking things out of order. That'll be a little bit challenging, but it gets us to where we want to be fast. But long term, this guy, gentlemen, we don't have a quick or fast answer for him, unfortunately. Sorry to waste this.
Yeah.
I really worked hard on that.
Clearly, a lot's happening here. It's all digital, right? No one uses analog anymore. But all of them are just such excellent drawers. Okay.
Before you get back on it, there is one other thing I'd like to mention. In the comp plan, because I was on the comp plan the last one, and I didn't like it then, I don't like it now, and to mention or go with what you're talking about density. In considered medium density was, when we're talking about residential, it was 20,000 square foot lots. I'm sorry, this is considered low density. 20,000 square foot lots all the way to 5,000 square foot lots. That's well a lot of,
It's too broad.
yeah, that's way too broad. So to mention, when we talk about density standards, we need to tighten that up.
Yeah, and I would argue for having more than 5. Because if you only have 5, then they have to be fairly broad, get you all the way down to a high density zone. And we are going to need some high density zones because we've got some high density uses. So we'll need, in order to get there, we may want to have 6 or 7. That's what it is. If you want to have that sort of that control versus flexibility, the more zones you have, the more control you have. But of course, you have too many, it's a little overwhelming. You want to be Goldilocks, right? Just right. Just right. Okay. So as we look at each zone, these are the characteristics that I'm proposing. It's slightly different than our consultant put together for you. And again, these are all open for feedback and discussion. The density is your primary control. If you kind of put density down at the bottom, density is, and this is the units we talk about. It's like 1 unit per acre, 2 units per acre, 3 units per acre. That's the density piece. Dimensional standards, these are secondary control. So this is the things like setbacks, lot size, things of that nature. Now, what are we trying to accomplish with those? let's talk about that for just a second, if we can. We have a dimensional standard, which is front yard setback. What's the goal when you're in a residential zone of setting a front yard setback?
It's a curb appeal thing. You drive through a neighborhood and have nice front yards because all the homes are set back. But when they're sitting on the street, it's more, it feels more closed in, more,
Uniformity is
not necessarily uniform.
Anything that applies, John, for both front and rear entry residential?
Do I think that applies more? I'm talking about just when you drive down the street. You have a driveway off that street to a garage, you know, if it's front or side or back loaded, it doesn't matter to me. I'm just, you know, what I see as far as dimensional standards and front setback is just really it really kind of plays into density a lot, I think, because I perceive the density to be a lot less when I have a setback and it's pushed back. When it's right up on the curb, I feel like there's more density. Even though these people may have the same size lot and these huge backyards, driving down the street, you don't necessarily feel that. So,
Well, I think when it comes to the dimensional standard component of this, I think that's where it has to be brought. Because that's where you get into the market trends. What is the market asking for? What are people looking for in their new homes? So that, in all of that, that has to be very broad.
yeah, because I also think that, when you start talking dimensional standards like we have right now, side yard setback or side setbacks as well, and, that's kind of contradicting our whole concept of going to a density base versus a standard development code, because I may want to keep that house 5 feet from the side property line, because that allows me to keep more of these beautiful trees or whatnot. So if I have to push the house over, I'm going to take out 3 trees that I don't want to. So.
Yeah, that can be accomplished by a minimum and then a percentage.
Right.
So you say in the city, we're not gonna tolerate less than a 3-foot side yard setback unless we're gonna be in a 0 lot line situation. Where we intentionally have houses right up on the lot line. So let's say we set 3 feet or 5 feet. We say 3 feet or 10% of the overall lot width. So if you have a really wide lot.
Don't like that, because if we have 100, let's say 10% of our lot size and we have 1,000 feet, 1,000-foot lot, then we're going to say that our setback on the side is going to be 100 feet.
Right.
Well, see, I wanted to move it over to keep more of this.
Well, that's where you can come in with the incentive that you can decrease the side setback to the minimum if you're preserving some natural element. So your minimum standard always prevails. So you can have this 3-foot or 5-foot side setback or 10%, because realistically, your largest lots are probably gonna be 100 feet wide. Yeah. Just looking at the realistic market trends, you're not gonna build 1-acre lots in town. The price of the land is too expensive, plus the carry cost of the city. Your densest development is 1/2-acre lots, ranch style houses. And if you look at that on a 150-foot lot, 15-foot setback on either side makes sense, because you can put a driveway in it and have side entry. So it starts to accommodate it. Or if you have trees, you can slide it over to this minimum 5-foot setback, and now you have 30 feet on the other side next to your neighbor in green space.
And the only thing I was saying was, I think the minimum is sufficient.
Just utilize the minimum, not a percentage.
The problem with that is, if I get a vacant lot in between 2 houses that exist, and that, we create the zoning language like that, then is my neighbor moving over essentially with a 3-foot setback from the property line for his house, coming over to my house, where if he wants to turn, and I've used this before, if they're like me and you've got a stereo I can hear a block down the street, and they want to play their music do I, as an existing home, want that house that close to?
Is it Rath or Country Music?
Yeah, we can maybe find out in statute.
I think the city money ordinance will take care of that.
Yeah, but I want to get back to sort of perks. Okay, so I started you on front setback, because our current standard that's proposed in front of you is a minimum setback, 50 feet back from, well, if you're trying to reach consistency, if your goal is consistency, you don't want a minimum, in fact, you don't even want a maximum. You want to build to line, which is actually a form-based code idea. But basically, it says, we want everybody to build their front of the facade to be 20 feet off the right. Because then that gives you the consistency, if that's your goal. If you don't care about sort of how far they sit back, you just want to make sure that they sit back at least a certain distance, then you do a minimum, and they can go back further. But then that gets some flexibility, but it also creates some of that non-conformity.
Yeah, does not the built-to line though allow you to be farther back than the built-to line? Or are you required to be on the built-to line?
You're required to be on the built-to in the current form-based.
Otherwise, it would be a
Well,
minimum.
That's a bad term.
Yeah, that's
We're talking about what we're gonna.
not do. I'm just using that as an example.
So since the code is to be written for not a specific piece of property as such in a pursuit of specifically locale, but broadly across the city, I think you have to take into account, does a piece of property, residential, front on what we would call a collector street? And if you allow the setbacks to be so close to the road or the current right of way, does that inhibit the city from, as things change in the future, that road may go from a wide 2-lane to actually needs to be a 4-lane?
Wow, that is awful. Isn't that, I mean, excuse me, but, I mean, what we're doing right now, that's an awful long-term, potential possibility, maybe someday. I mean, I don't know that it, I don't know that
Dexter
it, I don't know that it.
Dexter Road is a perfect example.
What is?
Dexter, from 66 down to Milton. A lot of those houses run on the front end. You have all of development, only 2 houses and 3 houses developed on the other side. And if you get them and allow them too close to the road, whenever Dexter is widened, if it ever is, which it needs to be, then you cause a problem, because now I can buy the current right of way through there, but then basically the house is sitting right on the street. Do you really want that?
I think that, would that not be addressed in your, thoroughfare plan?
It may. Certainly.
But you've got a zoning.
So then, in that case, you can give them a minimum setback from the potential right of way. Actually, from the right of way.
So this is just
Those
one of the decisions we're gonna have to make. So I'm just gonna, I use this as an illustration. I'm gonna use enough, I'm gonna change up, because I'm not gonna actually make a decision today. But let's talk about dimensional standards. Dimensional standards are things like minimum lot size, maximum building height, width and depth of the lot, coverage ratio. Those are the kind of things that fit into this characteristic list when we take a look at zoning. And you've seen some examples. They talk about in R1, it has to be a 2,400 square foot building. It can't be more than 2 stories. Do we care about that? Is that important to be that specific? If it is, how specific do we need to be when we come in with these dimensional standards about minimum lot area? Because you have to sort of, again, we talked about, if we have the density base, one of the things we want to provide and serve that is to give it a little bit of flexibility when it comes to minimum lot area. But you still may want to set a minimum. That minimum may have some flexibility to it. That you may want to still, when you're in a R1, for example, our lowest density one, you may want to say, well, it's gonna be at least, 4,000 square foot lot. No, I'm sorry, not a 4,000 square foot lot. It has to be, what's half an acre? 20,000. Has to be at least a 15,000 square foot lot. You know, I mean, that's the kind of idea. You want to give us flexibility, but do you want to bound it through these tools? Or you really want to say that if you're on an acre lot, your house can't be any more than 2 stories? Is that, do we have a,
You know, so
is that something that we have a public purpose that says you can't have a 3-story house on a half acre lot? Building height, you know, so these are the kind of things that, as we walk through, when we get to talk about defining R1, your opinion will be needed. You know, just trying to highlight sort of what the policy is behind those decisions and what we're trying to accomplish.
To give an example of just minimum lot area, we talked about density and we're using R1, which is an average of, we're calling it half an acre or 1 acre. And what you're trying to avoid, I assume we're trying to avoid, is a pocket of townhomes and then 2 large lots. And then the blended gets you to half an acre average lot area size. So you would say it needs to be half an acre, 20,000 square feet, but will allow a minimum lot area of 14,000 or 15,000. So if you have a pie-shaped lot or an atypical lot on a creek line, that doesn't get pulled out of the project. You can still build a house there if that's a desirable location, even though it's below the average, because the average is going to be 20,000 square feet. So you're going to have some at 15, 18, 21, 25, 30, and they're going to average to 20,000.
But does an R1, okay, when you're saying half acre to 2 acres, I mean, what about neighborhoods that are currently that, you know, like they're quarter acres and stuff like that? I mean, is that also included in R1 or what?
Yeah, quarter acres technically would be like it would be a different zoning category because you're at 4 units to the acre.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, each one's going to have its own development, current development pattern, future development pattern. It's going to be locked into that zone, permissible in that zone. That's why we need potentially more than 5. But we're using R1 as the example just simply to start someplace.
Right, okay. Now, I was getting confused because I'm sitting here looking half acre to, and I'm going, wait a minute, most residential developments aren't half acres, they're quarter acres. I mean, if not, yeah.
Or if not smaller.
Yeah, it's not small. So there would, R1 would be, actually move up 1, and then R2 would be, I mean, I guess we would have to redefine what is an R1, right? Is that what we're saying?
It's just your lowest density residential district.
Okay.
So that's, to answer your previous question about, is this standard nomenclature? Yes, in the industry, your R1 or SF1 is going to be your lowest density, and then the highest number is going to be your highest density.
Okay.
Do you
Well,
have,
yeah.
do you have the materials with you? Because that's really what that is telling you for each one. And I mean, that's kind of the roadmap to the question you're asking, I think.
Okay.
Might answer this.
Because they even talk about a minimum width and then the percentage.
So my suggestion, one of the suggestions I have in here is that when we talk about dimensional standards, we really stick on width, depth, and minimum lot area. Max building height and coverage ratio, I think that's more of kind of a, we move that down to the, what is the one I wanted, to building standards rather than dimensional standards. Because I think that's, we're talking about the building, right?
Right.
So to me, that just makes a little more logical sense. If we want to do a max building height, and there's some areas where we will want to do a max building height. Certainly when we have a higher density where we're allowing something that's going to be taller, if it's next to lower density, we'll want to have a transitional standard as you drew last time, right, erased, I thought. We'll want to have a max building height adjacent to that lower development to mitigate the impact.
Are there many communities that actually allow 3-story residentials? Okay.
Especially on big lots. I mean, I just came from Minnesota.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of little McMansions in Minnesota. and they're huge.
And the reason I call it 3 stories is because you end up with 2 floors with 12-foot ceilings or 12-foot ceilings and 10-foot ceilings, and then you're at 22 feet plus 2 feet of crawl space between, and then you have an attic, and all of a sudden you're 36 feet, which is a 3-story building. But you have one floor with an elevated ceiling and then space to move around.
Okay, that makes sense.
Really, so it doesn't mean
Does
it's
not-
a
Yeah, I'm
high-
sitting here trying to
high
think, the last time I saw a
standard.
3-story house, other than in Galveston.
Yeah, these are not straight up and down townhouses.
Yeah. I don't know many split levels, you know.
Yeah, but it just goes back to the point I'm making here, is when you're talking about my recommendation, we always have that touchstone of what's the purpose? We don't just throw out a number, but we throw out, what are we trying to accomplish that number? Going back to your excellent examples, and say, with a minimum lot size, we want to have that combination. We're using density as the primary, but we want to have a secondary control at top that sets a minimum, so we don't end up with townhouses in an R1.
And to go to your question about 3 stories, my niece and her husband just recently sold their house in Florida. It's 3 stories, literally. He's a doctor. His next door neighbor was an orthopedic surgeon. 3-story house, huge. Their house is 10,000 square feet.
Yeah, there's a.
No basement, years 1, 2, and 3?
Setbacks, we had a lot of this conversation already, but again, when you talk about setbacks, what are you trying to accomplish? With the front setback, the side setbacks, how much flexibility do you want to have? And I'll propose that these will change dramatically when we're talking about R5 or R7 versus R1. And that's, by keeping that purpose in mind, you can then talk about whether we're going to allow a 0 lot line development, whether we're not going to allow a 0 lot line, whether we want to have a big setback or whether a smaller setback will still function in that neighborhood. And then the last one, so the building standards, dwelling unit size, building height. Do we care? Some places we will, some places we may not. Any thoughts about that?
Say that again.
Well, do we want to say that you must have a house that's 22,400 square feet in an R1?
I'm not exactly, actually, I'm kind of opposed to that.
Yes.
Because, there's people who maybe have 1 kid, 2 kids, or just older couple, or even a younger couple who aren't gonna have kids, but want some property. You should not have to saddle them with, a 46,000 square foot home or something, or whatever it is. They should be.
Fall in that category.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what was running through my mind, because we have 435 acres to develop. Okay, let's say I'm moving to Rowlett, all right, and I want a 10-acre piece of land and build a house. Where does that, that's only a rare scenario, but that's kind of the point. I mean, how do you do that?
Yeah. But it goes back, of course, you guys have trained as a lawyer, like these two over here. Your job is to understand the counterpoint of the argument, right? So I'm gonna make the other argument. Well, if you're taking up an acre of land, you better have some value on that property. We
The
don't want
property
you to.
itself is value.
Yes, but not near the house. If you're gonna take up an acre of our land, we wanna make sure you build something that has a certain level of value. So it better be, 3,000 square feet and have some nice slate roof on it, because we wanna actually get some money off of that. What's your purpose? So do we let the market do what the market's gonna do? As you say, you're paying that for that land, you're probably gonna sell it to somebody who wants a bigger home. But there's always the possibility they're wanting to move a trailer on it, right? Save some money and build it later? Is that allowable?
You mean a pre-manufactured home?
Well, I mean, if you go to the point too, if I buy that land, I'm gonna do what I want with it.
Right.
Because it's my land.
To some extent.
That's why we have zoning.
That's what it is.
Oh, yeah, zoning. No, you're not.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't we all also want to consider what the market's done? I mean, the vast majority of Rowlett was built in 1985.
Yeah.
Right, so shouldn't we be considering what new developments are looking like? And be, attractive to more development that's meets today's standards. 1985 was completely different than today. Housing costs were completely different in 1985. Interest rates were a little higher too, but that's another story.
Carter, you bring up an excellent point. And one of our first sort of conversations was about some of the political pressures at the state level that's could potentially impact our authority moving forward. And one of those is a bill that would remove the authority to have basically a minimum lot size and require allowance for much higher density. Minimum lot size allowed by that statute is 1,400 square feet. You couldn't park most of the vehicles in our community on 1,400 square feet. It's pretty tiny. But so what they're basically saying is that you got a lot of density within the cities. And that goes back to the theory, okay, where should density happen? And that's where you're getting rural legislatures and urban legislatures to agree, because the sprawl is starting to impact the environment and our agriculture. So they're saying, okay, we don't want to stop losing farmland to subdivisions. So you guys need to move this density into cities. And then that's a big move that's happening right now. Could that impact us? Not so much. To a certain extent, we're built. As we talked about earlier. It certainly would allow a lot more density in the infill and redevelopment opportunities that we do have. But as we have that conversation, we take a look at our infill development, certainly paying attention to what the market is going to be a key part of the conversation. Now, whether you want to make room for that or not, again, it's still part of, now completely black has never happened to me before. There we go. There we go. But anyway, important point. As we sort of walk through this process, to a certain extent, we're built out community. Our ability to impact it is going to be fairly narrow for us to kind of the future.
But there will be redevelopment opportunities, and we should keep an eye on them.
Absolutely. There we go, expand. Okay. This is only the third meeting. Before we get too far off track, is this working for you guys? Is this approach comfortable? Do we move faster or slower? What do you think? Faster? Faster. I've got one vote for faster.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
What, are you gonna say you're a slow learner?
Is it like holding the fast? Really fast.
Okay. Here's my proposal for the next step. So rather than have you guys go through it, well, actually, you have in your worksheet, you have that, you have a worksheet. I encourage you this time to really play with that. Take a look at what we put together as far as a framework, and I'll send this out as a revised sort of worksheet for you in the way I've sort of defined the characteristics. So you can start working on this and look around your community and say, okay, if we do this, how's that fit my neighborhood? How's that fit the neighborhood down the street? You can sort of have those ideas. My proposal is that we bring you back a straw man. Well, that we basically give you, this is
Right.
the residential zones.
Yeah.
And then we start working through them, R1 on down, and getting your feedback to clarify, change, or revise. That way, instead of sort of bringing you one at a time, we'll bring you the whole thing. In a fairly, rudimentary way. We're not going to go into all of the dimensional standpoint. We'll go through all that. But anyway, we'll bring you a starting place, and then you guys can give us feedback on that. If you guys love what we did, guess what? We move quick. if there's some areas where there's some friction, we'll slow down.
Sure.
Sound like a reasonable process?
Yeah, I'm a visual guy, so can you show us examples of an R1 high density in Mesquite or in, specifics where this has changed and what it looks like?
But I got a question about what you're asking for. You said you want to see a R1 high density?
Well, I'm sorry, I misstated that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
No,
you're right, yeah.
Okay.
We'll probably bring you examples here.
Yeah.
So we'll say this is R1, this is where it would fit in Rowlett to existing development. Because that's basically what we're doing. We're really zoning the existing development. The areas where it'll allow change will be the exception, not the rule. So we'll go grab existing neighborhoods, starting with SF40, and basically saying, okay, we're gonna apply R1 to existing SF40. How's it fit?
On the map up there, all the areas that are basically just in gray, now, no real color added to them, that would be what is defined as an R2 right now, right?
If it's gray, it's outside the city limits.
Yeah.
Huh? Oh, you're talking about the dark
The
gray.
area that does not have colors.
The dark gray.
This area right here.
No, the dark gray. Like Theodore Miller and Rowlett Road down here. That area right there, no color in it whatsoever. That would be R2, right?
No,
This right here?
Yeah.
No, this is, it's gonna be dependent because there's some R5 in here.
There are?
Yeah,
Okay.
there's some SF5 in here. There's some SF40s.
Actually,
So,
almost
I mean,
all of that's PD.
Okay.
Well, with an underlying whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, so that's all already zoned.
Okay.
that's mainly SF 10s, 9s, and 8s. If you're putting it on that,
Yep.
that's the bulk of it.
But the new R code would now go back and there's no grandfather. Everything would be get the new classification, right?
Correct.
Right.
But the goal would be to make it consistent with what's already there.
Okay.
That's our conversation about conformity and non-conformity.
Right.
We want to make sure as best as we can we make it conforming. Unless we choose to make something non-conforming, and that's of course a different conversation. If we want to push something to change to something else, we make it non-conforming. Or if we think something is so out of character with the paradigm we want to put in place, it may become unconforming because we simply can't fit it within the model.
Is there any regulation, safety code, or fire code, or whatever, that defines how far on the lot you have to step back the dwelling?
No, there are building standards that apply if you're zero lot line. So if you have a property line and your zero lot line, you got two pieces of property that are right next to each other, there's definitely a building code and fire code that applies to
Right.
how those walls are constructed.
But there's nothing about how far back from the street or the sidewalk it has to be.
Certainly, there's a distance you need before you get away from those regulations.
Yeah.
Right, that's a question, and actually for Parker, not to put you on the spot here, but, Trails of Cottonwood, I think you said it in one of the earlier meetings, to a certain extent, a lot of what we're talking about is what's going on up there, right? If you drive around and you want to see what an R1 that is 5 blocks away from an R4 and how those integrate, am I correct that if you want to go up there and drive around, at least get just a general feel for what this looks like and how it integrates, and as we talked about, what new development looks like, and we know what Rowlett is built off, but as we go to new development, I'm one half to think the model you have is probably what modern development looks like. So I guess I'm saying we're looking for examples, that be some, folks go up, drive around and kind of get a little bit of an idea of, hey, okay, I kind of get this. I know I driven around when I did the first time, I was a little surprised because I was expecting,
Utter chaos.
yeah, I was expecting 6,000 square foot house, and they're all gonna be round, and they all, they all had the same setbacks, you know what I mean? And it's not that traditional neighborhood. So as we talk about, maybe real life examples that are here in town, not with the designations on it, but I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Sure.
But I wanted to ask you if that's a good example.
It's a good example, because on the west side of Trails of Cotton Creek, you have Saxe, Murphy, Garland, that all come together. And so you have 1 acre and 2 acre tracts. And so in order for the development to be compatible, we set it back from the roadway there so that those 1 acre tracts are not looking directly at somebody's garage. So the development is pulled back, green belts created. And then on the north end, to your point, Mr. Chairman, we have manufactured housing. And so we went ultra high density is adjacent to us on that side. And so we pulled back there, and there's a different density that we're utilizing up adjacent to that to be more compatible to what's surrounding you. So you can see low density and high density, and then now the Trails of Cottonwood is only 3.2 units to the acre. But it actually is very low density compared to what it could be.
Would it be helpful to you to have a map that shows the existing zoning in our community?
Sure.
We will make you to a link that, so you have access to take a look around the existing zoning. The tool's a little cumbersome to use, so we'll give you some instructions on it.
Yeah.
You will run into a lot of PDs.
I was gonna say, can you quantify the PDs, as here's what they're closest to built out density is closest to.
They do have an underlying zone, because Mr. Pollard said, they do have an underlying zone. So they're all built off of
Something.
something.
With a bunch of assumptions.
Right.
Yeah, a bunch of things.
So, let me just throw this out and before it gets too late. So if you had a R1, and you said, one dwelling per acre, or half acre. Let's do half acres, one dwelling and half acre. R2, which would equate with 3 units per acre, an R3, that would be 4 units per acre, and so forth, on down.
It could, or it could be different than that.
I understand, and put out to the side, what sort of lots sizes in the current underlying zoning of most of the town that would equate to. For instance, if you have 4 units per acre, you're looking at 10,000 square foot lots or larger, minimums. Okay, but if you go down to one category like 5, then you can have what we're used to knowing as SF8 to SF9, and any above that could go in to that category.
But that, of course, you lose some granularity, you lose some specificity if you make it too broad. You can certainly say that, look, our R4 is going to be everything from our current SF7 to SF5. Put them all into
But
one.
if you want to talk about density, that if I'm Ogard and I'm trying to change to a new area of density, then I'm gonna, if you want to go to density, I'm gonna be looking at, okay, how many units per acre? If Cottonwood, for instance, is 3.2, you probably wouldn't have any problems with that. But if it came in with 5 units per acre, I'm gonna have a whole lot of difficulty and heartburn with that. That's when we start getting into, I think, what was talked about is high density. Then, do we really want to have 6 units per acre or more than that in single family residential? Because now you're getting into tinier lots and the perception on the homes. Does the dollar value equate to a house? No. I can build a 4,000 square foot house and put virtually nothing in it and be a $300,000 house. but I can take a 1,800 square foot house and put a ton of the amenities and stuff in it, drive that price up to 400,000. But, you know, do I want, but I think for most of us, do we want cheap homes that downgrade our homes and pack the city? I think that gets down to the bottom line.
So typically you have a diminishing return in value for the larger the home, the price per square foot. So in order to make the math work, the price per square foot is higher on a smaller lot with a smaller house. And then the price per square foot goes down as you get a larger lot and a larger house. You just can't charge the same value for the other piece. And I think for Rowlett specifically, something that we have to consider for these redevelopment tracts is you may have a retail corner that's small and the retail has gone defunct or may go defunct at some point in time. And what are you going to do with this 5-acre tract? And how are you going to let that redevelop? And the highest best use might be a nice residential community instead of a, you know, a CBD store that's going to go out of business with Texas outlaws shortly. So, you know,
What about liquor? Is that okay too?
I mean, I really like a liquor store. I live close to one.
You should live there.
Yeah.
Get a lot.
That's, you know, you just have to figure out what are you going to do with that parcel, and you don't want to box yourself in. We talked about this at one of the first meetings.
Housing numbers.
Right. You want to be careful about that because there are some cities that have intentionally left out zoning codes and then they get stuck. There's a city we talked about in the first meeting that intentionally never did any high density residential or commercial. And now they're at the intersection of two major thoroughfares and they don't have the zoning for it. And they have the developer that owns the property saying, I want to build here, but legally they have no way to do it because they don't have a PD and they don't have commercial zoning. So they have to rewrite their entire zoning code for this to happen.
And I think this is probably what you seem to be arguing, see if I get it wrong, is you want to make sure that there's enough granularity in these zoning, that we don't end up with something that we don't want.
Right.
That we actually zone it in a way that is protective of the density that you are comfortable with.
Right. When I first came on PNC in '95, first time around, the city as it was zoned could have driven up to 110,000 population. That was the projection of the max 110. Can you imagine this city and getting around in a 110,000 populated town? I mean, we have some unique characteristics. Got a damn lake that cuts this town up. You can't build roads everywhere to get across. And I don't want to see the population density to 100,000. We'll strangle on our movement.
Well, to Christoph's point when we started, just because you create the tool doesn't mean you have to implement it. So do you want to create the full set of tools of here's what all the residential codes could look like, and here's the highest density we would allow, but that doesn't mean you have to assign it to a piece of a parcel. And if the developer comes in and says, I want to use this code, P&Z can say, we don't want you to. We've deemed it to be R3 and we don't want it to go to R7. And you can deny their request.
I understand, but that's what I'm saying is that having the density of the R number represent number of units per acre. So that you look at the density.
R to the number of units per acre.
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
That gives you as a builder a flexibility of what you build in there and the lots that you work with. Not telling you you've got to have all 9,000 minimums, but that gives you the flexibility to work with the land. But at the same time, it protects the city
You'll end up
from having an
skipping
explosion.
You'll use R.5 and you'll go to R3 and then to R5 and then to R7 probably. So you'll end up skipping zoning categories. If you just go units per acre, average units per acre.
I think always looking through the lens of highest and best uses is critical. And so many cities have missed that. And like Louisville, they couldn't project in the future what that looked like.
Right.
We got a major freeway running through here. We should be thinking about what the highest and best use is.
I think that's a challenge we have because of those resources. We've got vacant lots that can't develop. because the value of the land is too high. And that's a problem, just as much as if the value was too low. We also have a lot of vacant storefronts because our rents are too low. You know, it's a careful balance of trying to get that place where you can have the right mix, the right capacity to meet market demands. Right now, we're out of balance. Out of balance with our values kind of coming up and our rents currently being low. So it's a challenge. And with these arterials moving through here, we're going to continue to see a lot of traffic, just because there's lots of people who come through here.
Yeah.
That's kind of like Dart, that ending it here. What do we get? Well, everybody from Rockwall comes here and you start. But
Then you get, how do we address the issue with the bridge we don't own?
We'll have to have some deep conversations with the city of Dallas to try and sort that out.
who do I need to talk to?
I'll call the mayor.
Eric Johnson.
You start off with the common issue. Is the city truly looking at doing away with the alley system and going to, I mean, are we looking at that as part of this of just front entrance, no rear entrance?
Well, whether you're going to stick with the alley system or not stick with the alley system is certainly a development standard, not a zoning issue.
Okay.
It's a development standard that we will likely want to address. I'm not presupposing what the outcome of that conversation will be. I'm just saying it's likely worth a conversation. I think one of the things that, did we require brick at one point?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Masonry.
Yeah, we can't do that anymore. So there's some things the state has already taken that regulation away from us. And I think Mr. Pollard brought up the right issue about alleys. Is that alleys, of course, reduces the amount of developable land and it creates maintenance and obligation moving forward because those alleys need to be replaced on occasion. And right now, we're behind. So we're trying to keep up with streets and alleys. It doubles the infrastructure that has to be maintained.
Is that a common trend that's going on of going away from the alley system?
I know, I've been in a lot of cities that don't have alleys. All front-loaded garages. I mean, look, most of Southern California, not all of Southern California's front-loaded garages.
You won't find an alley.
But even recently, Heritage, Homestead, I mean, they don't have alleys, they have views. I didn't know what a muse was, which is a really wide, nice alley that
But that's because they don't have a street.
I know, but so that's what I'm saying. You know, you start talking about terminology and all these different permutations. So to your point, I think keeping it high level at zoning and not getting down into just the details and the weeds and every permutation of this, that, or the other. I think just not waste time. It's certainly important for discussion, but I don't think that's what we need to focus on. It's not our purpose for right now.
Okay.
We keep going through the purpose of zoning, not development, and I think we're crossing those lines back and forth.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, but like I said, the only reason I brought up the alleys is in the zone, whatever you look at in the zoning, then if you want to get away from the other and do anything but straight front entry, you need wider lots.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That is a zoning issue.
But once again, we need to look at the zoning, and that would be part of, do you require dimensions on that block? Okay.
True.
Minimum lot size.
Yeah,
And then
once
once
that's part of the zoning is setbacks and minimal width of lots. That's part of the zoning.
minimum lot size is what we want to look at.
Yeah.
Lot widths or.
We certainly could look at lot widths. I think that the challenge, of course, is you gotta balance that against the flexibility we're trying to create. And if you basically tell people they have to have an alley, or they have to have a J-swing, and they get the option to choose that, I'm not saying they will, but it's just, then they can pick the lot width that's gonna serve that demand. Whether we have a lot width, whatever lot width we tell them, even if we don't tell them lot width. It's kind of like parking standards, I'm sorry, I'm digressing again. Lots of communities, the standard for the last 30 years has been minimum parking requirements, right? Lots of cities are getting rid of that, because businesses know what parking they need. If they underpark their business,
They're gonna lose money.
they're gonna lose money.
They're the ones that need to make that decision.
They know their business better than us, so they can probably set their parking standard. Lots of cities now have maximum parking standards to basically reduce these, Walmart-sized parking lots that go forever. And basically say, no, you gotta have less, rather than having minimum parking standards, they let the business decide. So that's kind of going back to lot width. We'll put in development regulations, whether we change them or not. And they'll have to adjust that lot width to meet that development standard without us having to tell them exactly what it has to be. Like our running system. Tell them they have to have an alley, tell them they have to have a J-swing. Tell them they can't have front loaded, and then they have to pick whether they can fit that in the design. Because you can do, sir, sorry, I'm gonna draw again. You can design a house with a J-swing, looks just like this. You can be pretty narrow. Is that the house I want with the parking garage right here? No, but certainly you could. I have a son in Southern California. He's looking at buying a house, and it's like this. I mean, it's like, I think the difference between two houses is like 3 feet.
Yep.
And he's talking about taking the first floor and making it his garage and building a second floor on top of it. So the living room will now be the garage. And guess how much he's paying for that?
670,000.
I'd say 1.2.
1.2. It doesn't matter because you got some solar on top of it because the rest of the bottom floor is going to be a garage. It's basically, it's less than 2,000 square feet in living space after.
I know it's not Palace Stage though anymore.
So the point I'm making is that
Ocean.
we don't need to pick the width. They can pick the width. We can tell them the development standards are. We want to make sure everything's adjacent.
Okay, so what you're advocating then is to put it in the design standards, not in the zoning.
Design standards, exactly. That's where, what we allow as far as garages. I told you I've done a couple of UDOs. One of the biggest fights I had in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was that the standard way of them building a house was a house that looked like this, and here's your garage, right?
Right.
2-car garage. This little front porch out here. And the real challenge, again, from a social engineering perspective, all your living space is back here, right? So no one pays attention to what's going on in the neighborhood. If you're sitting on this front porch, you can't even see a neighbor. All you can see is your garage and their garage, right? So we said, guys, you gotta stop this. Pull back the garage so it's even with the front of the house. Yeah. Just that. Don't pull it all the way out here. Just pull it back so it's even. They went to the state legislature and took our floor anyway. The building community was so offended by that. Plus they all hate me, they want to kill me back there.
And they all carry.
So, this is, something the development standards is an important piece of what you want your community to look like. Some states you have, currently in Texas, we still have the ability to have this conversation. Other states, you don't. Personally, I'm a fan of having some sort of, I live on Amesbury. People walk by our house. It's so nice. Our dog doesn't like it.
Yeah.
But it's a walkable community.
Yeah.
In North Carolina, if people don't even, Halloween doesn't work in the United States anymore. It's sad. So, I'm all for doing some things to actually create the community we want to create. But some of our regulations
You want to
Well, you can try to create that community, but if the community doesn't want to be created, it's not gonna.
Yeah.
They're all gonna be sitting back there on their iPads.
All right, so that gets us through the material today. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions between now and next meeting? We have a couple of to-dos for you. We're gonna pull this together as quickly as we can. You did try and get it to you before the meeting, so you have something to look at it. We're gonna get you a link so that you can take a look at the current zoning for our community. And we'll bring you some examples of what's out there in our community and how the districts that we put together may apply to those areas. Sound fair?
Yeah, sure.
So moved.
June 10?
No.
Pardon me? June 10? Yes. That's right, June 10?
Yeah.
Yes.
Before we adjourn, what I'd like to do, since we have two new people here, is go around the horn again and if you would, give your name and about what part of the city you live in, if you would, so that the rest of the people here can kind of get an idea of where all we come from. So, I'm Stanley Pollard, I went to me last time as chairman. I live over Westwood Estates, which is over by Rowlett Elementary, near the intersection of Rowlett Road and Miller. So,
Marciana Williams, I live off the Wood Horse between Miller and High School.
Tony, I live, right there,
John Gute, I live 2 blocks down the street.
Either two, other than Troller Bay 1.
Carter Holston, I live in Waterview.
Mark Denver, I live in Waterview.
also like our station team.
Jonathan Reese, on Harbor, it's where Chad is, in Lake.
Stan Martin, Baywatch Estates, off of Chaha and Kirby.
And I'm Preston Wallhead. I don't live in the city. I'm a developer, and we're working on a project on the north end of the city. But our project had pieces of the Rowlett Development Code and the form-based code, so we had a foot in both codes and experienced the dysfunction of both of them together. So when the city called and said, "Hey, would you be willing to give us some feedback?" I said, "I have a lot of it."
Good.
all right, motion to adjourn?
I said.
Adjourn.
Okay.
Sure.